If you've ever tried to stop binge eating, you've probably heard this advice at some point. Oh, you've got to stop restricting. And maybe you heard that and you thought, okay, but what does that actually mean? Because the word restriction gets tossed around in a way that confuses people and can make recovery feel impossible. I've met plenty of clients who start panicking about any no, any delay, any boundary around food because they've been told that if they don't eat the thing they want, the second they want it, they're restricting, and that restriction is going to inevitably cause them to binge. So they end up with this new fear, which feels like if I say no, I'm restricting, and if I'm restricting, I'll binge. Therefore, I must eat whatever I want immediately. That's not recovery. It's just a different type of trap. As we spoke about in episode 1, the issue isn't willpower, it's pressure on the system. And restriction gets misunderstood because not every no creates pressure. The goal of today's episode is to clarify what restriction actually is, what it isn't, and why the problem isn't that you ever say no. The problem is excessive restriction, the kind that creates distress, scarcity, and rebound eating. By the end, I want you to be able to tell the difference between a normal, supportive boundary and a deprivation pattern, and start practicing the kind of no that builds trust instead of panic. This is the Breaking Up with Binge Eating podcast, where every listen moves you one step closer to complete food freedom. Hosted by me, Georgie Fear, and my team at Confident Eaters. Let's start with something simple, but very important. Healthy eaters say no to food all the time. They may say no because they're not hungry, because they're going to eat later, because they don't feel like it, because they want something else, because their stomach feels off, because they're about to go to bed, or because they're choosing a real meal instead of grazing. That's not restriction. That's regulation. That's timing and preference in action. Restriction, in the context of binge eating recovery, is not the existence of limits. Restriction is when your relationship with food becomes organized around scarcity. I can't have enough. I'm not allowed. I have to earn it. If I eat that, I've failed. You can usually feel the difference in your body. A calm no feels like, not right now, later. A restrictive no feels urgent, loaded, and threatening. Here's the core reframe. The problem isn't delaying food. The problem is excessive restriction that increases distress. It's not about timing, it's about meaning. If you say, I'm not going to have ice cream right now, thanks. I'll have some after my dinner. That's not restricting. That's just planning. But if you say, I can't have ice cream, I'm not allowed. I have to be good. I can't eat that. That's restriction. That's scarcity. That compresses the spring that might pop back in your face. When the spring has been compressed long enough, it fires. It helps to separate two kinds of restriction, because as I'm trying to define here, only one of them reliably fuels binge eating. Practical boundaries are the normal limits that create stability. Eating meals at mealtime, choosing one dessert instead of 5, sitting down in a chair to eat, avoiding foods that truly make you feel unwell, stopping when you're satisfied because you want to feel okay afterward, choosing to say no to a particular dessert or fried food because you've already had plenty of sugar or fat in that meal or in that day. Those are not the enemy. Those types of no's actually reduce pressure and help you move towards your goals. They usually result in feeling positive. Deprivation-type restriction is different. That includes skipping meals to compensate, keeping food overly clean and unsatisfying, forbidding foods, rigid rules that you just can't maintain, or living in a constant, I can't eat that mindset. That kind of restriction increases distress, and distress is the spark. There are predictable reasons that deprivation restriction backfires. Biologically, undereating increases food preoccupation and urgency. If you've ever been on a diet, you know this one. Once you start eating, it can feel harder to stop, not because you're weak, but because survival circuitry is alive and active. Psychologically, forbidden foods become more salient, more important, more enticing. And when a rigid rule breaks, the brain often goes, well, I blew it, might as well keep going. And for many people, restriction is also nervous system threatening, especially if you have a history of dieting, food insecurity, or emotional deprivation. Scarcity can register as unsafe. This is where the urge for limitlessness, not just taste, comes from. This connects directly to what we'll talk about in the next episode. When pressure on the system builds high enough, eating can shift from regulated to urgent very quickly. Now, here's a common misunderstanding I think is important to clean up. When some people hear restriction leads to binging, they interpret it as, I should never say no, I should never delay, I should eat what I want immediately. That jumps from restriction straight to chaos without building stability in between. Recovery is not yes to everything always immediately. Recovery is learning how to eat enough, eat consistently, include satisfaction and flexibility into your meal choices, and tolerate normal wanting without treating it like an emergency. Basically, we don't want to jump from always saying no to always saying yes. We want to know when to say no and when to say yes, and that we're going to do both throughout our lives. Wanting food and not eating it right this second is not restriction. That's adulthood. We want things. We can't have all the things we want right in that moment. So, how do you tell the difference in real time between something that's a healthy boundary and something that's restriction and could theoretically lead to binge eating? Ask yourself 3 questions. First, am I saying no to this instance, or am I saying no to everything? Healthy boundaries are selective. We might say no to ice cream right now because I don't feel like it, but I'm not saying no to ice cream forever. For deprivation level restriction, the no tends to be more global. Like, no, I don't eat that, I can't eat that, that's bad for me. The second question you can ask yourself, is there a real yes built into my plan somewhere? Supportive boundaries include a believable yes. So to use the ice cream example, I might say no to ice cream right now, but in my mind, I know I'm going to choose a dessert that I really want later or tomorrow. Deprivation level restriction, on the other hand, doesn't include any yes. You're just supposed to be okay with this permanent no. The third question, does this decision decrease my distress or increase it? And sometimes this is the only question you need. When you feel calmer, that usually means you're choosing something to support yourself. If you feel panicky, that might mean that you're being too restrictive. So, what is the solution if we start to realize the difference between these 2 types of choice? The goal is not never restrict, as I've said before. The solution is a relationship with food that includes enough structure to feel steady, enough permission to avoid scarcity, enough satisfaction to avoid backlash and rebellion, and enough flexibility to live your life. Here are 3 practices that support this. First, consistent, adequate meals. Underfeeding keeps pressure high. It's important to not leave the table if you are still hungry. Also, adequate meals include starches, fruits or vegetables, protein, fat, and fiber. If you get in the habit of skipping the starch or avoiding all of the fat, or just not including any rich source of protein, you're selling yourself short on satisfaction. Second, planned inclusion. This is permission with structure. With clients, we often talk about what lower nutrition foods they really love. Maybe wine, chocolate, or potato chips. And we make a plan for how they'll fit in. Being deliberate about the portion size and the frequency is what makes weight loss realistic. We plan to include them. Completely banning these foods does not usually create lasting results, because eventually people run out of willpower and they just start eating them again. And that starting again is rarely a calm, intentional, guilt-free serving. More often, it's a tense, shame-filled experience because it feels like, oh my God, I'm breaking a rule, I better go all in. And guilt and shame don't pair with moderation any better than oil and water. The third practice I'd like you to try: set one gentle, trust-building boundary. This isn't a long list of rules, just a small agreement with yourself that you can reasonably keep. That matters because consistency is what supports weight loss and helps your brain stop treating eating as an emergency. A boundary that might work for you is eating seated, which can be deceptively powerful. When you sit down, a meal becomes a defined event instead of background grazing, and that alone tends to reduce intake. Plating your food is another one. It makes the portion visible and finite, which creates a natural stopping point without requiring willpower in the moment. Another boundary that you can try helps with second portions. If you want a boundary to help you resist taking second helpings automatically, try this. Pause for 60 to 90 seconds after the first portion, then decide. The pause is just enough space to ask, am I still physically hungry, or am I chasing relief, comfort, or something else? If you're still hungry, you can absolutely have more, but keep it structured. Serve a planned second portion onto a plate and enjoy it calmly. Other helpful boundaries that don't feel like deprivation: one planned snack time instead of all day picking, or treats only eaten when you're sitting and you're eating them off of a plate, or no eating straight from a bag or a box. The goal of all of these isn't rigidity, it's creating just enough structure that eating becomes calmer and more predictable, which is where sustainable weight loss actually comes from. With many of my clients, we call these guardrails. These are the type of behaviors that aren't rules, they're things that we put in place to keep us where we want to be, metaphorically on the road, and not careening down the canyon walls. We feel safer when we have our guardrails in the right places. Here's the takeaway from this whole episode. The restriction that fuels binge eating is distress-based scarcity. You can absolutely lose weight without creating that kind of pressure by using delay, choice, attention, planned permission, and trust-building boundaries. Recovery is the middle path between excessive yes and excessive no. In the next episode, we'll talk about stress and state changes and why food decisions get tougher when your nervous system is already maxed out. And if you want support building your middle path without swinging between extremes, you can work with me. Coaching details are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.